Hey guys, welcome back to this month's Patreon exclusive Sculpture Geek Director's Cut video. This month we're going to be tackling the Deathclaw. I hope you enjoy. The first time I ever played Fallout was way back in high school at a friend's house, and I didn't really get much into the game back then, but when Fallout 3 came out, I was totally hooked on it. Much like the rest of the world at the time, it was really when I fell completely in love with the Fallout universe. And while I really like most of the character designs, like the Mirelurks and the super mutants and the ghouls, in particular the Deathclaw, I thought was one of the coolest creatures I've ever seen. Especially the way the Deathclaw in Fallout 3 as well as Fallout New Vegas is designed. It's reminiscent of the horror movie icon Pumpkinhead, which I'm also a huge fan of. I knew eventually one day I'd want to get around to sculpting one. Then I saw the trailer for Fallout 4 and the Deathclaw selfie, which is just a portion of the trailer where you just get a quick glimpse of the new Deathclaw design, but he's holding the main character up and it looks like he's taking a selfie. I'll include it here so you can see what I'm talking about. And it's a pretty inadvertent little fun thing that happened, but I think overall ended up even making the character more popular. Anyway, as soon as I saw that new design, I knew that that was the Deathclaw that I wanted to sculpt, and it fell in line perfectly with timing because it was when I just decided to start doing more personal projects. Anyway, I thought it'd be really cool to make the Deathclaw sort of like a trophy head mount because I just wanted to have something to hang in my game room. Unfortunately, at the time of making this video, he hasn't been molded quite yet, but I do plan on doing that soon and giving him a proper base and a paint job and hanging him up, and I'll try to make a video of the paint process as well. Here you can see I used some acrylic spheres for the eyes, and that's not something I do all the time, but it worked out okay with the Deathclaw because he doesn't have irises or pupils or anything, and so it didn't appear to me that he had that convex protrusion coming from his eyeball that an eye usually has. So the perfectly round sphere kind of lent itself to that, and it's good because they can serve as an anchor for measurements and things like that, but sometimes it can be tricky because you need to play with the depth of the eyes when you're sculpting, and that can be a bigger pain to do because you'd have to dig the entire sphere out as opposed to just adding clay or subtracting it. But since it's not a human portrait or a likeness, I felt pretty confident with it. Here you can see I'm just adding small pieces of clay to establish all the musculature that's happening underneath the surface of the Deathclaw's skin. And there's a ton of anatomy and fun stuff going on under there, which is one of the reasons that it looked so appealing to sculpt in the first place. And there you can also see one of the small benefits of having those acrylic spheres as the eyes, because you can just sculpt the eyelids right on top of the eye and not have to worry about keeping the surface of the eye totally smooth. At this point, I'm still dialing things in and trying to get them to look correct, and you'll see a lot of the musculature and secondary forms that are happening in the Deathclaw's face. There you can see a small shift where everything's been kind of raked over and amalgamated, especially in the eyebrows where the expression was changed just to make them look a little more menacing and angry. You can also notice that I put some yellow paint on the eyes, and that was just to lighten the eyes up a little bit because the Deathclaw's eyes are actually closer to that color. And it looks a little messy, but it helped a lot in visualizing things because the dark eyes were kind of just messing with my perception. Ultimately, it was meant to be scraped off before molding, and I was actually in a little bit of a rush to get the video done because of work constraints. I did end up scraping it off not long after though. And I like to show adding the really small bits of clay and just kind of tweaking and dialing things because it's a really important part of the process that a lot of people may not realize since you're just making small incremental changes. But all those little tiny blobs of clay are what's helping to bring the forms up and make them look full, and even helping to smooth the piece out a little bit as well. And for that process, I mostly use my spatula minaret tool to just kind of tamp down little pieces of clay that are too small to add with your fingers. Now you can see here I've cut a rough length of armature wire and I've bent it into shape because I'm going to use that for the horns. So what I have there is basically a receptacle for the horns that I'm going to put the armature wire into, but first I want to create a plug on the end of it. So I'm going to mix up some plumber's epoxy putty. I always wear gloves when I mix this stuff up because the chemicals can leach into your skin and cause all kinds of diseases and things, so better safe than sorry. Anyway, after mixing it, I have a small bend in the armature wire that I'm just going to put this stuff over and then create a plug with it. So I'm going to make sort of like a trapezoid shape with the smallest part at the end. That way, I'll be able to remove it from the clay a lot easier and it won't get caught up. And this stuff hardens up really quick, like within 5 minutes, so usually I just let it harden up just enough and then I'll start trimming it with a knife. and then when it hardens fully, I'll file it down to make it nice and smooth. And then I usually dust it with some talc so that it doesn't stick to the clay. Then once it's all set up and cleaned up and everything, you can just sculpt right over it and you'll have a piece that's removable. So that not only makes it easier to actually sculpt because you'll have access all the way around the piece now, but it's also necessary if you want to mold the piece, because otherwise it would either be very difficult or impossible to mold. Here I'm just finishing up the horns and just putting a little bit of detail into them, and I'm hitting it with a stipple sponge because that helps to blend things in and soften the texture that I've put on it already, and it also kind of leaves a nice little subtle texture behind itself. And then this is one of my personal favorite parts here, where I put the horns on and it cues up with the music to make a really satisfying thud. That tool right there, I actually made that tool. I call it the Chubby, and it's really good for certain areas like under the neck where the sculpt gets a little too close to the board and a larger tool wouldn't fit. Then here we have a quick little montage of the final detailing, and these are some of the tools that I use to add in some striations and define the piece a little better to sort of up the resolution. And the Deathclaw has so much of this fun detail going on that I really enjoy that part of sculpting when there's no more problem solving and you could just get lost in detailing the piece for a while. Here I put the final sculpted teeth into place, and those are made from translucent Sculpey. And the reason I did that was because with there being so many of them, you can put them in and sculpt the gum line without fear of denting or dulling them. The teeth were sculpted into shape and then pre-baked to harden them, then filed, sanded, and finally put into place. I also think it looks a little cooler in photos because the translucent Sculpey looks pretty close to a real tooth. And finally, here's the full reveal. And if you've actually played Fallout, you should be able to recognize this character here. His name is Vault Boy, and he's sort of like a mascot for the Fallout universe. And you find these things hidden all over the map within the game, and depending on which one you get, it will raise the player's stats. I bought the statue at GameStop with the release of the game, and only made the loop tool and changed the logo on the bottom. So this is sort of an homage to that, and I call it the Sculptor's Perk. And then for the final shot here, we have the Vault Tech Assisted Targeting System, or VATS, which is basically an in-game mechanic that anytime you're in combat with another character, you can use it to target specific body parts. So this was an homage to that as well. And that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed this month's video. Thank you again to my Patreon supporters for making content like this possible and allowing me to continue to follow my passion. Thanks for watching. Until next time.